Hi guys, Miss Osborne back again with another WSQ. We're looking this time around at imperialism. As you watch the video, answer the guided questions that are provided. You may need to pause or rewatch the video in order to answer the guided questions. When the video ends, go ahead and summarize the main points of the video in paragraph form. Make sure that you use specific vocabulary that are going to show up as bolded and underlined words during the video. Then finish by asking one question. This can be something that you're still confused about, a general question, or a discussion question for the class. The essential question that we're going to be answering in this video is how did new U.S. ambitions and acquisitions in the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific lead to debates about America's role in the world? Spartan historians will analyze the reasons and results of U.S. diplomatic and economic initiatives as a part of their imperialist agenda. Imperialism is just the extension of a nation's power over other lands. This can be political, it can be economic. Europe is the first continent to first embrace this imperialistic attitude when they went and imperialized Africa, and then they began moving into South America. The United States is following close behind, however. The main reasons why countries imperialize is when they're looking for new markets to sell some finished goods, or they're working for raw materials. It also served as an ability to have navy ports throughout the world that would strengthen the United States militarily. In addition, political power was also a reason why. The more land that you got, the more power your country had, both economically and politically. And then lastly, a lot of Americans believe that they were culturally superior to other countries. They're Protestant, they had civilized technology, and so they really felt like, also democracy was a big part of this, right? So they believed that they had the best and most awesome culture and economic systems and political systems. Theodore Roosevelt's foreign policy was the most popular one during this time period, and he said that our foreign policy should speak softly and carry a big stick. And this aggressive form of foreign policy became known as big stick policy. So Americans started establishing sugarcane farms in Hawaii. However, there's not a lot of Hawaiians to work the farms, so the farmers brought in workers from China, Japan, and the Philippines. The more money that they made, the more control that they wanted to have over Hawaii so that they could make their farms more profitable. The American business leaders that were there started forming a union called the Hawaiian League, and they wanted to overthrow the Hawaiian monarchy that was there so they could establish American democracy there. Again, that's where we see that cultural superiority. They signed the Bayonet Constitution, which severely restricted the power of the King of Hawaii and also deprived most Hawaiians of the right to vote, and also established Pearl Harbor as an American port. Queen Liliuokalani became queen in 1891, and she was not having any of that American control. She wants to take back control from the Americans and do away with the Bayonet Constitution. So the American business leaders who were threatened by her sought to overthrow her and annex Hawaii to the United States. The U.S. Marines participated in this overthrow, and they stormed the royal palace, forcing the queen to surrender. Sanford B. Dole, who you might know from Dole Fruit, became president of the newly established Republic of Hawaii, while Congress considered a treaty to annex the islands. Hawaii doesn't become annexed until President McKinley a couple years later, and it doesn't even become a state until 1959. China had remained pretty much isolated from the rest of the world. In 1842, the British began to trade with them, but from then on, the Chinese tried to limit Western influence from China because the British had tried to take advantage of them with opium. Spheres of influence had opened in China, and spheres of influence were essentially geographic areas where outside nations exerted special economic or political control. The United States, however, was too late to claim its sphere of influence. All the European countries had already gotten there first. So Secretary of State John Hay said, hey, why don't we open the door to all nations to create equal trading rights, and this became known as open door policy. However, the Chinese still did not like the Western influence. They felt like they were trying to take away their culture and that the Westernized nations were doing too much. And so they formed a rebel group known as the Boxers that attacked these foreign missionaries and foreign groups that tried to colonize them. They led the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 that would combat the Western influence. However, this led to an increase in support for open-door policy abroad because now the Western nations would have to work together in order to take advantage of the trading opportunities that China offered. By the 1890s, there's only two remaining Spanish colonies, Cuba and Puerto Rico. The Cubans wanted to fight for their freedom against the Spanish, and so the Americans helped them do that. There was a lot of Cuban civilians that were being forced into like civilian camps, like internment camps, because the Spanish were trying to keep them from supporting the rebel forces. During this time period, there's no radio or internet or television. Everybody gets their news from newspapers, and the newspapers were printing these shocking stories about the way that the Cubans were being treated in these internment camps. This became known as yellow journalism. Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer led the charge on these. They told scandalous stories trying to get the attention of their readers. They only told stories from the Cuban perspective, not the American perspective. The New York Journal printed a letter from Enrique de Pueyrredón, a Spanish officer, that insulted President McKinley, saying that he was weak. And Americans never wanted anybody to consider they were weak, let alone their president, so they started calling for war. Not surprisingly, within that same time period, American battleship USS Maine mysteriously blew up in the Havana harbor, killing over 260 soldiers. And so American newspapers started yelling for war against Spain, saying, "Remember the Maine! Remember the Maine!" So America finally declared war on Spain, leading us into the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War, however, was fought on two fronts because the Spanish had two major colonies, the Philippines and Cuba. Theodore Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, said to the U.S. Navy in the Philippines that if we go to war with Spain, you should attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. And so that led to their quick defeat and Americans' ease in taking over those islands. The Teller Amendment was passed with the Cubans, because it was an American treaty with the Cubans, essentially saying that once Cuba frees itself, the United States promises that they would recognize Cuba. The Teller Amendment agreed that the U.S. would leave the government and control of the island up to the people, which is what the Cubans really wanted from the Spanish. Theodore Roosevelt organized a group of fighters called the Rough Riders. It was essentially a group of the ruffians in society, the college athletes, cowboys, ranchers, miners, and they wanted to seize the Cuban city of Santiago so that they could have control over Cuba. So they went to the fight at the Battle of San Juan Hill, which allowed the American forces to take control over Santiago, and pretty soon after that, the Spanish troops in Cuba surrendered, and the United States won the Spanish-American War. When the Spanish lost, they had to give up all claims to Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. The United States said that they would pay the Spanish $20 million because this was a lot of more land than they had actually conquered. Now, with the winning of the Spanish-American War and the gaining of those territories, the United States now became a competitive imperial power. There was, however, some people who didn't believe that imperialism was the right thing to do, and they are called the anti-imperialists. They believe that they should not annex the Philippines, and we should not imperialize, because they felt like imperialism violated the American ideal of self-government and democracy. If we were taking over these areas, we're essentially taking away their right to choose what kind of government that they wanted. If we also take over these countries, then there's a lot of immigration concerns because it gives them more opportunity to come to the United States, which was a big fear of nativists during this time period. Eventually, the United States agrees to annex the Philippines with the goal of preparing the islands for independence. They won't gain independence, however, until 1946. To restore order in Cuba and in Puerto Rico, the United States set up military governments on each island. And essentially a military government is when the general of the military is leading that area and kind of taking it over and being like the governor in that area. America had promised that it would not annex Cuba, but it was fearful that other imperialistic nations, especially those from Europe, would try to take advantage of their the opportunity to do business with there. So the United States passed the Platt Amendment that would limit Cuba's ability to sign treaties with other nations and give the United States the ability to intervene in Cuban affairs. It also required the Cubans to sell us some land, which led to the establishment of Guantanamo Bay. Under the Platt Amendment, Cuba became a protectorate, meaning that it was protected by the United States from other countries. America does not make Puerto Rico a protectorate. However, it becomes a territory. And the Four-Acre Act was passed that established that the United States would appoint Puerto Rico's governor and upper house of legislation. Puerto Rican citizens today do not have the right to vote in any sort of public election, but they do have a representative in Congress who does have a voice for the Puerto Rican people. In 1917, the Puerto Ricans are allowed to become U.S. citizens. In the 1880s, a French company began a project to allow ships to go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean without having to go all the way around South America. Thus, the Panama Canal was born. When the French company went bankrupt and essentially fell apart, the American government seized the opportunity to make lots of money by building this canal and being in control of trade between the Atlantic and the Pacific. So it started negotiations with the Colombian government. However, those negotiations didn't go very far. The Colombian government was in charge of the Panamanian people in Panama. And so Theodore Roosevelt attempted to overthrow the Colombian rule in Panama to gain their support, and eventually the Republic of Panama was established. Once it's established, Panama, of course, grants the United States the right to build the canal. Building the canal, however, is not really easy because there was a lot of injuries. It wasn't really safe to build anything that big. There was malaria from the mosquitoes. But finally, in 1914, the first ship was able to pass through. So in this picture, you can see that the length of the different canals, right? So all those different red dots are different door openings to another part of the canal. This is what the canal looked like when it was being built. So as you can see with the guy closest to the camera, it's very dangerous. There's no sort of straps or anything to hold them in. After the Spanish-American War, presidents began to back up the Monroe Doctrine that essentially said that any European countries that interfered in American affairs would be met with force. So the presidents began to back that up to protect American economic interests in Latin America. Europeans and Americans had invested a lot of money in these countries to build infrastructure and technology, and many of these countries were now unable to pay back the loans. So President Roosevelt issued the Roosevelt Corollary that essentially stated that any American force would be used if the European countries tried to seize any of the South American countries. They didn't ask any of these countries for permission, and so it ends up leading to a lot of resentment. Under President Taft, the U.S. influence over Latin America also increases. His foreign policy was called dollar diplomacy, essentially saying that he wanted to promote American economic interests by using our economic power or the power of the dollar to achieve these policy goals. He ends up buying out all of the different loans that the Latin American countries had to the Europeans so that they can take them over. As you watch the video, make sure that you had answered all the guided questions. You may need to pause or rewatch the video in order to answer the guided questions. Then, once you feel like you have a good understanding of the video, summarize the main points of the video in paragraph form. Make sure you use specific vocabulary given to you on the WSQ sheet. These showed up as bolded and underlined words during the video. And then don't forget, make sure you ask one question, something you're still confused about, a general question, or a discussion question for the class. Thanks for joining me for this WSQ. I'll see you in class.